The Rafah operation, which gathered the reaction of the whole world, brought with it a development that will bring an early end to the war. The Israel Defense Forces, which finally identified the tunnel line used by Gaza militants a few kilometers north of the Rafah border crossing, has signed a critical operation. The IDF's move, which also managed to rescue the last group of hostages, the militant organization's only hope for continuing the war, brought widespread celebrations in Tel Aviv. The leader of the illegal paramilitary organization, Haniyeh, is begging for a ceasefire. October 7, 2023. The airstrikes of the illegal paramilitary organization stationed in Gaza against Israel have left the Middle East facing the darkest period in its history. Described as a disaster in world politics, militant groups entered Israel's borders later in the night and took hundreds of Israeli citizens hostage. Since then, the Israel Defense Forces, which have made greater progress every day in their self-defense struggle than the last, have repeatedly conducted simultaneous operations against militant deceptions in Gaza. The militant group, which has suffered very heavy defeats in more than 2 months and has become unable to even respond, has agreed to release the hostages in groups if a temporary ceasefire agreement is reached. Ultimately, a temporary ceasefire agreement was signed on November 24, 2023, with the approval of the Israeli forces, whose primary priorities were to secure the release of the hostages and ensure border security. However, militant groups that violated the temporary ceasefire, which can be extended for up to a week, in their last hours believed that they could continue the war over southern Gaza, from which they withdrew during the ceasefire process, until Rafah realized that they were approaching the border gate step by step. Militant groups, which are getting closer to the southern borderline of the region every day, have finally resorted to a diabolical plan. The militants, who started using an area only a few kilometers away from the people residing in the temporary compound created around the Rafah border crossing as their new headquarters, thought that Israel would not be able to conduct operations near the Rafah border. However, the Tel Aviv government, which wants to prevent the spread of conflicts to a wider geography by winning the war as soon as possible, has signed a decision that will surprise even the Western Bloc countries led by the United States. In accordance with the instructions of the Tel Aviv authorities, who decided to launch a ground operation against the Rafah region despite all warnings, the Israel Defense Forces recently began organizing simultaneous operations in the region. During this process, the Israeli Foreign Intelligence Service, which conducted a very extensive research on the region, was making instant strategic interventions in the operational order of the soldiers in the field. However, the main critical point was a movement that Israeli intelligence officers detected over the region later last night. When they examined the satellite images, the IDF turned all its attention to the shipment point based on this critical information provided by the Israeli Intelligence Service, which found that a large group of militants was moving about 20 kilometers south of the point where they were located, and took action at first light in the morning. The Israeli soldiers, who had hastily reached a tunnel entrance hidden in the designated area, left the operation to the Sayeret Matkal troops from this point on. The Sayeret Matkal team, also known as the IDF's Special Forces units, which has carried out many critical hostage rescue operations during the war, entered the tunnel line extremely cautiously. Unlike the other tunnel lines they raided during the war, the Israeli Special Forces troops, who managed to reach the center in a much shorter time, were completely surprised by what they saw at this point. Having identified a secret point where a large number of hostages were being held near the narrowing corridor line, the Israeli soldiers decided to take control of the tunnel before rescuing the hostages. Surprised by what they suffered in the face of sudden attacks by Israeli forces, the vast majority of the militants were neutralized during short-term clashes. A small number of militants realized that they could not even respond and retreated as if fleeing towards the other exit point of the tunnel line. Thereupon, the Israeli Special Forces troops, who immediately evaluated the short-term advantage they had gained, managed to get out by taking the hostages in the tunnel line with them. The Israeli people, who learned that the hostages who were transported first to the north of Gaza and then to Israel via armored personnel carrier vehicles had been rescued, started huge celebrations throughout the country. The Tel Aviv parliament believes that these developments will ease the criticism from world politics. However, Although it has brought the hostage crisis closer to a solution, the attitude of the Western Bloc countries, led by the United States, towards the Rafah operation does not seem to have changed yet. The biggest reason for this is that the Rafah border crossing is the primary route point for humanitarian aid convoys to Gaza. The White House administration, which continues to insist on Tel Aviv to step back because humanitarian aid cannot be delivered to those in need as long as the operation continues, stated that they have stopped providing military and financial support to Israel until this situation is resolved. Similarly, United Nations Secretary-General Guterres stated that the Rafah operation was an extreme move and could cause the war to spread over a much larger area. In this process, the fact that the tensions experienced by the Western Bloc with Israel are seen by the Iranian government as an opportunity further increases the concerns. The Iranian authorities, who have been doing their best to spread the conflict over a wider geography since the first day of the war, and to continue it for a long time, have taken action again after the United States stopped providing support to Israel for an indefinite period. Until now, the U.S. authority in the region has been ensuring that Iran's provocations remain dysfunctional. But now, Iran's warmongering has mobilized many Islamic countries in the Middle East. With the exception of a few, almost all Islamic countries in the Middle East have issued a critical statement against the Rafah operation. The most striking point of the statement demanding the withdrawal of the Israel Defense Forces from the area and the reopening of the border crossing was the last message in the nature of an ultimatum to Tel Aviv. Islamic countries, which stated that they will take an all-out military intervention if their demands in the declaration are not fulfilled, have mobilized to form a jihadi coalition led by Iran. Analysts predict that if such a crisis occurs and Islamic countries declare war against Israel, the war will not be limited only to the Middle East. The comments of experts who stated that such a religious struggle would bring with it the footsteps of a global catastrophe, such as a new world war, turned the attention of the whole world to the response from Tel Aviv. Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu believes that if they can continue the operation for a while longer, they will be able to completely eliminate the militant group stationed in Gaza and achieve absolute victory. Political experts said that this insistence could lead to a much bigger crisis, so Israel should agree to withdraw from the Rafah border crossing as soon as possible, risking the continuation of the war for some time. As protests continue in many countries to end this war, which has caused the greatest international tension in the history of world politics, the U.S. Senate will share its decision on whether to impose military sanctions on Iran in a very short time.